The millionaire's special daughter cried from being forgotten. The nanny remembers and does the impossible with almost nothing. But what the father does upon arriving, no one was prepared to see. Arthur Vance gazed out at the New York City skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass of his corner office. The distant skyscrapers looked like miniature pieces in a high-stakes power game he masterfully controlled. Every light burning was a reminder of his empire, a vast fortune built on the foundation of bold Wall Street investments and the cold negotiation of stocks that rose and fell to the rhythm of his commands. His life was a precise mathematical equation, where capital multiplied in a constant flow of dividends and interest. The walls of his secluded estate in Greenwich, CT, minimalist and silent, reflected the order of his mind. They were high walls that not only protected him from the world, but also isolated him from it. Upstairs, in a room with equally expansive windows, his 5-year-old daughter, Laura, saw a different world. Her almond-shaped eyes, the sweet hallmarks of Down syndrome, did not register buildings or balance sheets, but the butterflies that danced in the immaculate garden, a spectacle she always watched alone. Arthur loved her with a suffocating intensity, a love he translated into security and material wealth, believing he kept her safe by keeping her invisible, far from a world he considered cruel and imperfect. It was into this setting of luxury and silence that Elena arrived. She carried the scent of freshly baked bread from her modest apartment in the outer boroughs and a simple tote bag, but what truly distinguished her was the brightness in her eyes. It was the glow of someone who had seen pain up close, and because of it, had learned to find the seed of joy in the smallest things. She crossed the imposing gate, feeling the weight of that universe, so distant from her own. Arthur received her with the same coolness with which he analyzed an assets and liabilities report. His words were few and direct. A strict manual of rules regarding Laura's care, the required discretion, and the prohibition against altering any routine. "You are here to fulfill a function, nothing more," he said, without even lifting his eyes from the crypto charts on his tablet. To him, Elena was just another piece in his organized existence, a contracted service to fill a gap that his time, valuable in dollars and euros, did not permit. He failed to notice the way her hands tightened, nor the immediate compassion that flooded her face when she heard the girl's name. Elena's first encounter with Laura was a whisper amid the house's silence. The girl was sitting on the floor, surrounded by expensive, untouched toys. Her small fingers held a crayon, with which she was drawing on a sheet of paper. Elena approached slowly, sat down beside her without a word, and simply observed. Laura wasn't startled. On the contrary, she looked up at the nanny and offered a shy smile, the first those walls had seen in a long time. In that instant, Elena didn't see a condition or an inheritance. She saw a child starved for company. Later, while tidying the room, she found a small shoebox beneath the bed. Inside, dozens of drawings, all of the same theme: cakes, colorful cakes, with lit candles, balloons, and smiles. They were the silent record of a buried wish, a mute request that no one in that house seemed to hear. One of the drawings, the most recent, held something extra. In one corner, in shaky, childish script, a date was scribbled. A chill ran down Elena's spine. The date was the following day. A knot formed in her throat as she realized the crushing truth. Laura's birthday was tomorrow, and the silence in the estate indicated that the only person who remembered was the birthday girl herself. The next day dawned gray, the pervasive grayness of the northeast, wrapping the estate in a mist that seemed to mirror the cold atmosphere within. Elena quickly learned the rhythm of the house, a timed silence, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock in the parlor and the hurried steps of the staff, who moved like discreet shadows. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Sterling, a woman of rigid posture and severe gaze, made it clear from the start that she viewed the new nanny as an anomaly. "Mr. Vance prizes order and discretion," she said, her voice clipped. "Any deviation from the established routine will be communicated to him. The child does not need excitement, she needs care, and that is all." Mrs. Sterling was the gatekeeper of that gilded cage, a loyal defender of the isolation Arthur imposed, and she saw in Elena a threat to this fragile equilibrium. Every gesture of affection the nanny showed toward Laura was met with a look of disapproval. Every attempt to initiate a more spirited game was cut short with some excuse. The housekeeper represented the embodiment of the house's rules, as cold and impersonal as the business contracts that guaranteed her employer's vast wealth. Elena, however, refused to be intimidated. Her focus was Laura, the small soul floating through that immense house like an angel with clipped wings. She spent hours by the girl's side, not forcing interaction, but simply being present. She read stories in a low voice, helped her assemble puzzles that seemed far too complex, and slowly began to receive the most precious treasures in return. A genuine smile, a tiny hand reaching for hers, a look that said more than any word. Arthur was a phantom presence. He arrived late at night, after Laura was asleep, and left before the sun rose. Elena saw him only in glimpses, a tall, elegant figure, always on the phone, discussing figures, stocks, and his net worth. He didn't ask about his daughter. He received a brief report from Mrs. Sterling. To him, Laura's well-being was just another item to be checked off his list of responsibilities, assurance that his most precious investment was secure. But without the need for an emotional involvement, he didn't know how or didn't want to give. On the eve of Laura's birthday, Elena's tension peaked. Arthur had flown to Europe to close a deal that, she overheard Mrs. Sterling proudly commenting, involved millions of euros and would further increase his fortune. He wouldn't return for 2 days. The house was quieter than ever, and the weight of the approaching date seemed to crush Elena. She couldn't get the image of the colorful cake drawings out of her head. That wasn't a simple childish desire, it was a cry for help, a shout for recognition muffled by luxury. That night, while Laura slept, Elena made a decision. She opened her wallet and counted the money she had left. It was little, enough for a week's transit fare. It was an insignificant amount compared to the gold and assets that family possessed, but for her, it was nearly everything. Ignoring Laura's birthday would be like stealing a piece of the girl's childhood, and that was a price her conscience was unwilling to pay. She knew she was risking her job, the chance at a better life. She knew she was challenging the order of that place. But looking at Laura's serene, sleeping face, she understood that some rules were meant to be broken. With her heart pounding erratically, she silently put on her shoes and tiptoed down the stairs. Like an intruder in her own life, the back door opened with an almost imperceptible creak, and Elena slipped out into the humid night, a purpose burning in her chest, to buy cornmeal, eggs, and a little color to paint joy onto the most important day in the life of a lonely girl. The mansion's kitchen was a sanctuary of stainless steel and marble, a culinary laboratory where private chefs occasionally created sophisticated dishes for business dinners that solidified Arthur's immense wealth. In the deep hours of that morning, however, the space was invaded by a simplicity that was almost subversive. Elena placed the bag of cornmeal, the dozen eggs, and the colored paper onto the cold countertop. They looked like objects from another world, humble and full of color amid the aseptic monochrome of the environment. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a mix of fear and determination. Every sound echoed frighteningly, the soft click of the refrigerator door, the sound of water in the bowl, the rustle of the paper. She moved with the agility of someone who feared discovery at any moment, knowing that Mrs. Sterling, with her light sleep and innate suspicion, could appear like a ghost at any instant. And that is exactly what almost happened. The moment Elena cracked the last egg, the corridor light flickered on. She froze, her entire body on high alert. Slow footsteps approached. With a quick reflex, she crouched behind the marble island, holding her breath, the smell of cornmeal and fear filling her lungs. Mrs. Sterling entered the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and stood there for a minute that seemed like an eternity, her eyes scrutinizing the dim light, as if sensing that something was out of place. Elena closed her eyes, praying she wouldn't flip on the main light. Finally, the housekeeper sighed and returned to her room. The click of the door closing was the most relieving sound Elena had ever heard. With the danger past, she resumed the task with renewed fervor. As she whisked the batter with a hand whisk, not daring to turn on the electric mixer, her mind drifted to her own childhood. She remembered the scent of cornmeal cake her grandmother used to bake in a wood-fired oven. In a small house where the greatest wealth was affection, the memory brought tears to her eyes, but it also strengthened her purpose. She wasn't just baking a cake, she was reclaiming a piece of her own history to present to a girl who had none. The cake rose in the oven, golden and fragrant, filling the kitchen with a homey aroma the estate had never known. While it cooled, Elena took the colored paper and scissors. With skilled hands, she made small pennants and paper balloons, stringing them together with a piece of thread she found in a drawer. She hung the improvised garland over the breakfast table, a fragile rainbow amid the opulence. The sun began to peek through as she finished. She was exhausted, but her heart overflowed. When the first rays of light poured into Laura's room, the aroma of the cake had already reached her. The girl opened her eyes and sniffed the air, curiosity overcoming sleep. She slid out of bed and followed the smell, her bare feet padding on the cold floor. When she reached the kitchen door, she stopped. Her eyes widened. She saw the colors, saw the simple cake on the table with a single improvised candle in the center. She saw Elena with a tired and tender smile. The girl approached slowly, barely believing it was real. She touched the tip of a pennant with her finger, as if to confirm its reality. Then she looked up at Elena, her voice a trembling thread of hope. Is it really for me? Elena knelt, coming down to her level, and caressed her soft face. Today is your day, princess. The smile that bloomed on Laura's face was like the sunrise, an explosion of pure light that illuminated every corner of that kitchen, that house, that life. It was a moment of pure, unaltered happiness, a perfect instant, suspended in time. But perfection is fragile. At the height of that smile, an abrupt sound broke the spell. The noise of a powerful car braking at the entrance to the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. Firm, hurried steps echoed through the entrance hall. A deep, familiar voice, one that shouldn't have been there, cut the silence. It was Arthur. He was back. Time seemed to freeze. Arthur Vance stood motionless at the entrance of the kitchen, his bespoke suit and leather briefcase contrasting brutally with the domestic, improvised scene. His eyes, accustomed to scanning profitability spreadsheets and stock charts, fixed first on the colorful paper pennants, then on the cornmeal cake with its solitary candle, and finally on his daughter's face, smudged with improvised frosting. An expression of disbelief and shock took over his usually impassive features. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. She jumped up, her body instinctively rigid, as if she could form a shield to protect the fragile joy of the moment. Every second of silence was torture, her heart beating louder than the clock on the wall. She waited for the explosion, the summary firing, the fury of a man whose control over his universe had just been violated in the most simple and unexpected way. Laura, sensing the change in atmosphere, watched the scared look on Elena's face, and then the imposing figure of her father in the doorway, and her smile faded. Arthur's mind, a machine for calculating risk and profit, struggled to process the information. This scene did not fit into any of his projections. It was an anomaly, a glitch in the perfectly organized system of his life. He, a multimillionaire whose net worth was discussed in finance columns, was paralyzed by a humble cornmeal cake. It was then, like a punch to the gut, that the realization hit him. The date, the penance, the cake. He, who would never forget the maturity date of a bond or the payment date of dividends, had forgotten his own daughter's birthday. Shame was a wave of heat that rose up his neck, a sensation so strange and overwhelming that for an instant he felt completely defenseless. All his money, his fortune in dollars and investments, suddenly seemed useless. A pile of worthless paper compared to that sugar-stained smile he had almost missed. Laura, in her innocence, broke the tense silence. She took a small piece of the cake with her fingers and held it out toward her father. "Daddy," she said, her voice clear and a little hesitant. "Cake." The simple gesture was more impactful than any multi-million-dollar negotiation. It struck Arthur in a place he kept locked away, a vault where he stored his vulnerabilities. Before he could react, Mrs. Sterling's austere figure materialized beside him, drawn by the unusual scene. Her eyes flashed with indignation upon seeing the disorder, the intimacy, the breach of protocol. "Mr. Vance," she exclaimed, her voice a hiss of disapproval, "I was unaware of this celebration. This is a severe infraction of house rules, a total lack of professionalism on her part." Mrs. Sterling's words were like stones, thrown to restore order and reassert her authority. She looked at Elena with poorly disguised contempt, sentencing her with her gaze. The accusation hung in the air, dense and cold. Elena felt tears sting her eyes, but she held them back firmly. She had no regrets. She looked at Laura and then faced her employer's gaze, awaiting the verdict. Arthur, meanwhile, was cornered. On one side, the cold logic of his world, represented by Mrs. Sterling and her rules. On the other, the raw, undeniable emotion of the moment, his daughter's smile and the cornmeal cake. He lowered his eyes to Laura's extended hand, to the piece of cake she was offering. That gesture held a value that none of his financial assets could reach. He slowly raised his head, and his gaze met Elena's. There was no anger in his eyes, nor gratitude. There was something far more complex, a storm of conflicting emotions that he himself could not decipher. The silence stretched, loaded with all the unsaid things, all the distance that separated them, and in that silence, the future of everyone in that room was being rewritten. Arthur didn't say a word. With an almost imperceptible gesture of his head, he dismissed Mrs. Sterling, who retreated grudgingly, casting one last venomous glance in Eleanor's direction. The millionaire then approached the table, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing in the kitchen. He knelt down, meeting Laura's height, and accepted the piece of cake she was still offering. The flavor was simple, just sweet enough, and carried a taste of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Genuine affection. He didn't thank her, nor did he smile. He simply chewed slowly, his gaze lost in the distance, as if processing a high-risk capital transaction. Then he rose, adjusted his suit, and, without looking at Elena, said in his usual neutral voice, "Clean all this up. The house routine must be maintained." And he left, leaving behind an atmosphere charged with uncertainty. His reaction was an enigma. There was no dismissal, but there was also no recognition. To Elena, that was more unsettling than an outburst of rage. It was like walking on thin ice, never knowing when it might break. In the days that followed, a subtle yet palpable change settled into the estate. Arthur began to break his own patterns. He arrived home a little earlier, in time to see Laura before she went to sleep. These weren't long or warm interactions. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching her play in silence, as if studying a being from another planet. Sometimes he risked asking a question about her day, his voice always a little clumsy, like someone speaking a foreign language. Laura, in turn, blossomed under the newfound attention. She included him in her games, pulling his hand to show him a drawing or a toy, And Arthur, the man who moved millions with a phone call, found himself disarmed by an invitation to have tea in plastic cups. Elena observed everything from a distance, her heart divided between hope and fear. She saw the connection between father and daughter forming a delicate and trembling thread, and she rejoiced in it. But she also felt Mrs. Sterling's eyes constantly on her, silently accusing her of being the cause of that disorder, that fissure in the wall of control the housekeeper worked so hard to maintain. The housekeeper was not willing to lose her post of influence. She began a silent campaign of sabotage. She insinuated to Arthur that Elena was overstepping, that her humble origins might be a bad influence on Laura. "She doesn't understand our customs, Mr. Vance," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice honeyed. "The girl needs structure, not cheap sentimentality." At the same time, news of the cake incident somehow reached the ears of Arthur's ex-wife, Savannah Thorne, a vain, superficial socialite whose main concern was maintaining the appearance of a solid family legacy. The idea of just any nanny taking initiative and gaining her daughter's affection sounded an alarm. Motivated by a mixture of jealousy and the fear of losing control over the narrative of her perfect life, Savannah reappeared. She called Arthur, her voice laced with manufactured concern. "Darling, I'm hearing things, an impromptu party with these people. Arthur, that is simply not appropriate for Laura. The image of our family. Think what people will say." Savannah's arrival was like a new player entering an already complex game, a move that promised to further complicate the delicate dynamic that was forming. She viewed Laura not as a daughter to be loved, but as an asset, part of her social image inheritance, and Elena's growing influence was a liability she was unwilling to tolerate. The pressure on Arthur mounted, and Elena, unknowingly, was at the center of a silent power struggle, where the prize was the heart of a little girl and the future of a man who was beginning to question the true value of his wealth. The estate was living under a new and fragile truce. Arthur, the man who transformed a small initial capital into a billion-dollar empire, found himself facing the most complex investment of his life, time with his daughter. He watched, from his leather armchair, Elena and Laura playing on the living room rug. They were building a tower with colorful blocks, and each time the tower tumbled, Laura's laughter echoed through the room, filling the emptiness that not even the most valuable asset could occupy. That laugh was an unexpected dividend, a profit not listed on any of his spreadsheets. He felt like a foreigner in his own home, learning a new emotional dialect. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to think that perhaps Elena was the best application he had ever made, a human asset whose profitability was immeasurable. But peace, much like stability on the stock market, was a momentary illusion, always on the verge of a crisis. The crisis arrived in a luxury sedan, its engine aggressively idling outside. Savannah swept into the house unannounced, a panther of silk and jewels. Her expensive perfume permeated the air, suffocating the scent of home that was beginning to settle in. Her eyes, cold as the metal of her credit cards, swept the scene in the living room and fixed on Elena with contempt. Mrs. Sterling followed her like a lady in waiting, her face brimming with poorly concealed satisfaction. "Arthur, we need to talk." "Alone," Savannah said, her voice a velvety whip, completely ignoring Laura's presence. The girl flinched next to Elena. Arthur stood up, hesitation plastered on his face. He led his ex-wife to his study, the same place where he made decisions that affected the cash flow of entire corporations. Elena felt a chill. She knew this conversation was about her, about the cake, about the joy she dared to plant in that sterile ground. She hugged Laura, who was trembling slightly, and began to hum a lullaby, trying to create a bubble of security amid the forming storm. In the study, Savannah's words were precise and venomous. "Have you lost your mind, Arthur? Leaving our daughter, the heiress to everything we've built, in the care of a nobody?" someone who has no notion of our world. She gestured, her gold bracelets clinking. I've received calls. People are talking. This affects our image, our social equity. They're saying you're mixing things up, that the house is becoming a mess. This woman is contaminating the environment with this ridiculous simplicity. Laura needs the best, appropriate stimulation, not cornmeal cake and poor people's games. Arthur listened in silence, his jaw clenched. Part of him, the part trained to protect his businesses and fortune at all costs, agreed with Savannah's cold logic. Image was, after all, a valuable asset. But the other part, the one that had just been awakened by Laura's laughter, rebelled. Laura is happy, Savannah, he managed to say, his voice weaker than he intended. Her reply was a scornful laugh. Happy? Arthur, she is a special needs child. She doesn't know what's best for her. We do. And what is happening here is not the best. It's a risk, a liability you are allowing to grow. She moved closer to him, her tone dropping to a calculated threat. I will not stand by and watch this. I will not allow my daughter's future to be compromised by a lapse of yours. This woman is confusing Laura's mind and, apparently, yours too. Arthur felt the walls closing in. He was trapped between the logic of his past and the emotion of his present. The pressure was immense, and his negotiation expertise seemed useless. He looked through the slightly ajar door and saw Eleanor embracing Laura on the sofa. The image was one of a safe harbor, but Savannah's words painted it as the epicenter of a hurricane. He needed to make a decision, restore order. Savannah, sensing his hesitation, delivered the final blow, her voice sounding like a judge's sentence. If you don't fire her, Arthur, I will do it myself. Furthermore, I will take legal action for full custody of Laura, alleging you are unfit to care for her. I will take her far away from all this inadequacy. Savannah's ultimatum hung in the study air, dense and cold as a vault chamber. For Arthur, a man who had spent his life transforming risks into profit, this was the most dangerous negotiation of all. The threat of losing Laura was not a financial liability. It was the total bankruptcy of his world. Every word Savannah spoke was calculated to hit his weak spots, his public image, his pride, the paralyzing fear of failing as the protector of his most valuable inheritance. He looked at the diplomas on the wall, at the stock charts on his screens, at all the symbolism of his fortune. These were his shields, the tools with which he had built his empire, and in that moment, the instinct for self-preservation, the same one that had made him a billionaire before 40, spoke loudest. He saw Elena's dismissal not as a surrender, but as a strategic maneuver, a tactical retreat to protect his most precious asset from a hostile takeover. It would be a loss, he rationalized, but a manageable loss. Keeping Elena meant a long, ugly custody battle, an exposure that could tarnish his businesses and, worse, traumatize Laura. In his mind, he was choosing the lesser of two evils. He was, once again, managing the damage. He emerged from the study wearing a mask of neutrality, the same one he used when closing an unfavorable deal. Savannah followed him, a barely concealed smile of victory on her red-painted lips. Mrs. Sterling, meanwhile, observed the scene with an almost triumphant righteousness. Elena stood up as they approached, her body tense with anticipation. Laura was still in her lap, clinging to her neck. Arthur stopped a safe distance away, unable to approach that circle of affection he was about to destroy. "Elena," he began, his voice coming out harsher than intended, "I appreciate your work, but your services are no longer required. Please settle your details with Mrs. Sterling and leave the house immediately." The words dropped like hailstones into the room. There was no explanation, no apology. It was an executive order, cold and final. Elena felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Her eyes sought Arthur's, searching for any trace of humanity, but found only the emptiness of a man who had closed himself off from his own heart. She didn't cry, nor did she beg. The pain in her chest was immense, but her dignity was greater. The only thing that mattered was the girl in her arms. She kissed the top of Laura's head and gently placed her on the floor. "I have to go now, my angel," she whispered, her voice choked. "But never forget that you are a princess." Laura didn't understand the words, but she felt the goodbye. Panic seized her eyes. "No!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the mansion's silence. "Lena, no!" She clung to Eleanor's legs, convulsive sobbing shaking her small body. It was Mrs. Sterling who intervened, pulling the girl away with unnecessary force. "Enough drama. The child will be fine." Savannah watched the scene with bored impatience, as if observing a spectacle of bad taste. Elena was escorted to the door like an intruder. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she had, her heart would have completely shattered. The door closed, and with it, all the light and warmth that had begun to infiltrate that house were extinguished. Laura's crying turned into a sharp, desperate scream, a sound that echoed through the corridors, bouncing off the marble walls and designer furniture. Arthur stood paralyzed, the sound piercing his armor. He tried to approach his daughter, but she repelled him, screaming and struggling. He, the man who had the world at his feet, couldn't calm his own child. After long minutes of agony, the crying abruptly ceased. A heavy, unnatural silence took hold of the house. Arthur took a deep breath, thinking the storm had passed. He went to Laura's room to check on her. The door was slightly ajar. The room, however, was empty. The window overlooking the back garden was wide open, the white linen curtains swaying gently in the breeze like a ghostly wave of farewell. Panic was an icy wave that swallowed Arthur whole. The sight of the open window and the empty room was a nightmare he had never imagined. His entire universe, built on the premise of absolute control, crumbled in a single instant. He shouted Laura's name, a guttural sound he didn't recognize as his own. He ran through the room, then through the house, his heart hammering against his ribs with the force of a sledgehammer. Mrs. Sterling and Savannah, drawn by the shout, appeared in the hallway, confusion etched on their faces. "She's gone! Laura is gone!" he roared, despair rupturing his facade of coldness. The frantic search began. Security was alerted, sweeping every inch of the meticulously designed garden. Mrs. Sterling, pale, coordinated the staff in the internal search, while Savannah, for the first time, seemed genuinely shaken, the phone trembling in her hand as she spoke to the police. The estate, once a haven of order, transformed into a chaos of anxious voices and hurried footsteps. Every minute that passed was a new layer of agony for Arthur. The fortune, the businesses, the assets in Bitcoin and gold, everything turned to dust, irrelevant in the absence of his daughter. Elena, meanwhile, walked through the streets of her neighborhood, her heart a shard of glass. Every step took her further from that world of luxury and pain. But the image of Laura's tear-streaked face was etched in her mind. She entered her small house, where the familiar smell of brewed coffee welcomed her but did not console her. The firing had been a harsh blow, but the separation from Laura was an open wound. She felt as if a piece of herself had been torn away. She sat down at the kitchen table, the place where she had so often baked bread and cakes with her grandmother, and the tears finally came, silent and bitter. She felt helpless, a discarded piece in a power game she didn't understand. It was then that she heard a timid knock at the door. Her heart leaped. Was it possible? Had he regretted it? But when she opened it, she was met by the worried face of her neighbor, Mrs. Rosa, a woman with white hair and a gentle smile. "Elena, darling, what's with that look?" the neighbor asked, stepping inside and embracing her. And it was in the arms of that simple woman, in the middle of that humble kitchen, that Eleanor finally broke down. News of Laura's disappearance spread like wildfire. It reached Eleanor's neighborhood through the television news, which displayed the photo of the smiling girl next to the imposing facade of the estate. Arthur Vance's name, the reclusive billionaire, was on every channel. Elena watched the report and felt the world spin. The pain gave way to visceral fear. She knew Laura's sweetness and naivete. She imagined her alone, scared, and a protective instinct, stronger than any hurt, took over her. She knew where Laura would go. It wasn't a logical certainty, but a deep intuition, a connection that transcended distance. Laura wouldn't run away to an unknown place. She would run away to the only place where she had recently found warmth and joy. She would try to get back to the cake, to the penance, to the smell of cornmeal. She would try to get back to Elena. At the same moment, at the estate, amid the chaos, Arthur found something fallen beside Laura's window. It was a small piece of paper, crumpled by her little hand. He opened it with trembling fingers. It was one of the drawings, a cornmeal cake, with a candle and two figures holding hands beside it. A small girl and a woman with a wide smile. In that crude, childish drawing was the answer, the only clue, the only thread of hope. He finally understood. Laura wasn't running away from home. She was running away to home. Arthur's car engine, normally a discreet purr signaling power and control, now sounded like a desperate roar as he tore through the traffic toward Queens. He didn't delegate the task to one of his drivers. He took the wheel himself. Laura's crumpled drawing clutched in the hand, not holding the steering wheel. With every mile, the scenery changed drastically. The glass and steel skyscrapers gave way to a labyrinth of side streets and narrow alleys, where exposed brick houses huddled together, painted with the vibrant colors of real life. For Arthur, it was like entering another country without a passport. The dashboard GPS tried to plot a route, but the logic of the asphalt there was different, more organic and chaotic. His car, a fortress of technology and luxury, was a spaceship in unknown territory. The purchasing power he possessed, capable of moving the stock market or acquiring vast investment funds, was completely useless there. In that moment, his net worth was worth as much as any of the men watching him pass, leaning against graffiti-covered walls. He was just a father, terrified and helpless, guided by a piece of paper. While Arthur was lost in his own despair, Elena acted. As soon as the intuition struck her, she stepped out onto the street, not in panic, but with a focused calm that came from a life of adversity. She wasn't alone. Mrs. Rosa, her neighbor, accompanied her, and the news spread through the neighborhood with the speed of a whisper. Elena's little girl is missing. Within minutes, the community mobilized. Mothers came to their doors. Children playing ball stopped their game to help search. The corner store owner grabbed his bicycle. There was no formal plan or chain of command. It was a network of affection and solidarity, a wealth not measured in dollars or euros, but in presence and care. Elena went door to door, showing a photo of Laura she kept on her cell phone, her voice firm, but her eyes revealing anguish. She's small, has soft eyes, and the sweetest smile in the world. She might be scared. Every face she met offered not just help, but comfort, a reminder that, even in difficulty, she was not alone. When Arthur finally found Elena's address, he had to park several blocks away. The car simply wouldn't fit. He got out. His impeccable suit and Italian loafers coated in a fine layer of dust within seconds. The noise, the smells, the pulsating life of that place assaulted him. Children ran barefoot, dogs barked, and a different music spilled from every open window. He felt exposed, vulnerable, an intruder. People stopped to look at him, suspicion etched on their faces. He, accustomed to being obeyed and revered, felt judged by a criterion he didn't know. He approached a group of women and, his voice strained, showed the drawing. "I'm looking for her, my daughter." One of the women, Mrs. Rosa, recognized him from television. Her eyes narrowed. "That's Elena's girl," she said, her voice cold. "The girl you sent away." Before Arthur could respond, a boy came running. "Aunt Elena! They found her! She's down by the corner lot, near Mrs. Cedar selling popcorn." An overwhelming relief swept through Arthur's body, immediately followed by a wave of shame. He followed the boy, his heart pounding uncontrollably. Across the street, he saw Elena running in the same direction. Their eyes met over the heads of the crowd, a collision of worlds, of pain and relief. And then he saw her. Laura was sitting on an improvised park bench, surrounded by other children, eating a bag of popcorn a woman had given her. She was safe. She was smiling. Elena reached her first. She knelt down and hugged Laura with a force that seemed capable of piecing together all the broken parts of the world. Arthur stopped a few feet away, a statue in a suit and tie amid the celebration of life. The scene hit him with the force of a physical blow. The daughter he had tried to protect with concrete walls and a fortune in assets was perfectly safe and happy in the arms of the community he despised and in the arms of the woman he had discarded. Elena lifted her face, tears streaming freely, and her gaze met his. There was no accusation in her eyes, only deep pain and a silent question that echoed louder than all the street noise. He opened his mouth to speak, to thank, to apologize, but her voice came out first, firm and devastating. "What did you do?" Eleanor's words, spoken without anger but with the weight of undeniable truth, hung between them. "What did you do?" was not just a question about the dismissal, it was a questioning of his entire life, of the house of cards he called a fortune, of the chasm he had created between himself and the only person who truly mattered. Arthur remained silent, shame paralyzing his thoughts. Here, under the curious and suspicious eyes of the community residents, he was just a man, stripped of his titles and capital. His expensive suit looked like a ridiculous costume. For the first time, he saw himself through their eyes, and the image was that of a failure. He watched Eleanor stand up, taking Laura's hand, and lead her into her simple house. The door closed, leaving him outside, on a stage that wasn't his, under a light that exposed all his flaws. He took a step forward, instinctively, but stopped. What right did he have to cross that threshold? What words could he use to fix what he had broken? He stood there for a time he couldn't measure, while life around him resumed its course. The children returned to playing ball. The music started again from the windows. He was an anomaly, a glitch in the system of that reality. Finally, he made a decision. He didn't return to his car. Instead, he sat down on the low wall of the corner lot, the same place where his daughter had been safe and happy minutes earlier. He took off his blazer, loosened his tie, and waited. He waited as the sun began to set, painting the sky with warm colors he never noticed from his office. It was an act of surrender. He was letting go of control, of rush, of efficiency. He was simply waiting. It was Mrs. Rosa who approached him, bringing a plastic cup of water and a piece of cornmeal cake wrapped in a paper napkin. "Eat. Looks like you need it," she said, her voice without the hostility of before, replaced by cautious compassion. Arthur accepted, his hand trembling. The cake tasted the same as the one he had tasted on Laura's birthday morning, the taste of home. "She's a good woman, Elena," the neighbor continued, sitting beside him. "She's been through a lot, lost her parents early, cared for her sick grandmother until the end. All she has is that huge heart, and you almost broke it." Inside the house, Elena cared for Laura. She gave her a bath, dressed her in borrowed clothes from a neighbor's daughter, and put her to sleep in her own bed. The girl, exhausted, fell asleep almost instantly, a serene smile on her lips. Only then did Elena allow herself to breathe. She looked out the window and saw him. Arthur, sitting on the low wall, the once imposing figure now looked shrunken, lost, part of her wanted him to leave, to let her be alone with her pain. But another part, the part that saw humanity even where it seemed hidden, felt a pang of compassion. He was a lost man, a billionaire in finance but bankrupt in emotion, whose wealth had impoverished him. She left the house and walked up to him. She didn't sit down, she just stood, waiting for him to speak. Arthur looked up. His eyes were red, tired. I don't know how to," he started, his voice failing. "I don't know how to fix this." It was the first time he had admitted a failure, an incapacity. "You don't fix what's broken, Mr. Vance," Elena replied, her voice soft but firm. "You rebuild. If there's something worth saving." He stood up, facing her. The distance between them was small, but the emotional abyss seemed insurmountable. "I want to rehire you," he said, the words coming out automatically, the solution of a man accustomed to solving problems with money. "I'll pay whatever you ask. Double, triple." Elena shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "You still don't understand, do you? This was never about your money. It was never about a job. It was about Laura. It was about seeing a little girl who deserved to be happy." The refusal hit him harder than the most expensive yes he had ever bought. He realized the size of his mistake. He had tried to resolve a matter of affection with a financial transaction. "Then, what do I do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, the question of a man who, for the first time, didn't have the map. Elena looked him in the eyes, and for an instant, the barrier between them trembled. "Prove it," she said. "Prove that you understand. Not to me, to her." She turned and walked back into the house, closing the door softly. But this time, the door didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like an invitation, a challenge. Arthur didn't leave. When the next morning dawned, painting the unplastered walls of the houses gold, he was still there. He had spent the night in his car, a luxurious, uncomfortable cocoon amid the symphony of crowing roosters and barking dogs that announced the new day. His suit, which cost more than the monthly income of many of those families, was wrinkled. The stubble scratched his face, and in his eyes was an exhaustion that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from the weight of a lifetime of misjudgments. He, the man who prided himself on his impeccable control, who analyzed the profitability of his investment funds with the precision of a surgeon, felt like an emotional illiterate, unable to decipher the code of that new reality. The door of Elena's house opened, and Arthur's world reconfigured. Laura rushed out, her hair still damp from the shower, and upon seeing him sitting on the low wall, she broke into a radiant smile. "Daddy!" she shouted, running toward him and throwing herself into his arms without hesitation. Arthur hugged her with desperate strength, inhaling the smell of cheap soap and childhood, an asset more valuable than all the gold stored in his vaults. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, a cup of coffee in her hand, and watched the scene in silence. Her expression was neither anger nor forgiveness. It was one of cautious waiting, like an investor observing a volatile stock before deciding their next move. Arthur spent the day in that limbo. He didn't dare ask to take Laura back, knowing that the estate, with all its wealth, was a much poorer environment for her than that vibrant community. Instead, he observed. He watched Laura play with the other children, sharing simple toys and laughter, an interaction he had never been able to provide. He saw Elena talking to the neighbors, the exchange of favors and affection flowing with a naturalness that he, with all his business and contacts, had never experienced. That place had a cash flow of humanity that his multi-millionaire life did not know. He spoke again with Mrs. Rosa, who, seeing his stillness and helplessness, seemed to take pity on him. It was she who told him about Elena's true work. "She's not just a nanny, mister," the woman said, while mending clothes. "In her spare time, she volunteers at a little school nearby, an improvised classroom in the church annex. For special needs kids who don't have anywhere else to go. She started it all with the little she had. That place is her treasure. The revelation hit him with unexpected force. The image he had of Elena, that of a simple woman needing a job, crumbled. She wasn't a victim of circumstances. She was a force of nature, an entrepreneur of hope, building a legacy of affection with resources he would consider insignificant. The nanny he hired to care for his daughter already cared for many other children. The affection she gave Laura wasn't just professional, it was her essence. He felt a pang of something that was neither shame nor guilt, but admiration. A deep and painful admiration that further illuminated the emptiness of his own accomplishments. His entire empire, his inheritance, his financial applications suddenly seemed like a child's game, a collection of shiny stickers without real value. He had spent his life accumulating assets, while she had spent her life distributing the most precious asset she possessed. By late afternoon, as the sky began to turn orange, he knew he could no longer stand still. The waiting was over. It was time to act, not as the billionaire Arthur Vance, but as Laura's father. He approached Elena, who was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. Laura slept in her lap. "And dear Elena," he began, his voice low and rough, "I won't apologize, because words mean nothing now. And I won't ask you to come back, because I know I don't deserve it." He paused, gathering the courage to ask the only question that mattered. "I just want to know, where is that little school?" Elena hesitated for a moment, surprised by the question. His request wasn't an order, nor a business offer. It was a plea for entry into her most sacred world. Without saying a word, she simply nodded and pointed him the way. The little school was a few blocks away, in the back hall of a small church. The place was the antithesis of everything Arthur knew. The walls were peeling, the floor was concrete, and the furniture was a patchwork of donations. But what it lacked in infrastructure, it made up for in life. The walls were covered with colorful drawings, and the air vibrated with the sound of laughter and a teacher singing a song about numbers. Elena walked in, and the faces of a dozen children with various intellectual disabilities lit up. She wasn't a volunteer, she was the center of that universe. Arthur stood in the doorway, observing, feeling like an intruder once again, but in a different way. He saw Elena kneel to tie a boy's shoe, help a girl hold a pencil, celebrate a completed puzzle with claps. She moved with a grace and authority he had never seen in any boardroom. That humble space was her empire, and her capital was unconditional love. He finally understood that Elena's greatest investment wasn't in applications that generated interest, but in lives that flourished with her care. Laura, who had followed him, ran into the room and was immediately embraced by the other children. She wasn't the girl with Down syndrome. She was just Laura, another friend to play with. Arthur watched his daughter integrate, share and smile with a freedom that the walls of his estate had always stifled, and, for the first time, he didn't feel the need to protect her, but the desire to learn from her. He spent the rest of the morning there, sitting on a chair too small for him in a corner of the room. No one paid him special attention. To those children, he was just Laura's dad, and that title, in that moment, seemed more honorable than that of billionaire. In the afternoon, back in the community, something magical happened. Laura, sensing the silent harmony that had settled between her father and Elena, began to act. With the spontaneity of a child who only knows the language of the heart, she took the hand of one of her schoolmates and pulled him closer to where her father was standing. Then she ran and fetched another and another. Soon, a small crowd of children, neighbors, Duskas, and Eleanor's friends formed around them, drawn by the girl's contagious energy. It was an impromptu celebration without cake or balloons, fueled only by the joy of the reunion. Arthur was in the middle of that whirlwind of life, surprised and disarmed. He saw his daughter at the center of everything, not as the heiress of a fortune, but as the guardian of a much greater treasure: community. Then the culminating moment arrived. Laura, her face shining with happiness, ran to him. She held his hand firmly. Then she went to Elena, who was watching the scene with tear-filled eyes, and held her hand too. She pulled them into the center of the circle, uniting them. She looked at one, then the other, and with a clarity and firmness that silenced all the noise around them, she spoke the words that would change everything. "You are my heart." The simple, pure, and powerful phrase echoed like a miracle. The masks fell away. Arthur felt a crack in his soul, and through it entered a light he didn't know existed. He looked at Elena, and for the first time, she didn't see the employer, the millionaire, or the man who hurt her. She saw only a father, his heart in his hand, offered by his own daughter. Slowly, he pulled her into an embrace. It was an awkward, uncertain gesture, but loaded with the full weight of his surrender. Elena, feeling the tremor in his shoulders, returned the embrace, closing her eyes and allowing herself, for an instant, to believe. When they pulled apart, she looked him in the eyes. The hug had broken the ice, but her gaze was a silent contract, demanding not money or promises, but something infinitely more valuable: time, truth, and the courage to rebuild. The embrace ended, but the bond created by Laura's small hand remained. The world around them, the vibrant and noisy community, seemed to recede, creating a bubble of silence where only the three existed. Arthur looked at Elena, and for the first time, he saw not an employee or a problem to be solved, but a partner in an endeavor whose value he was only beginning to comprehend. That moment was not the end of a conflict. It was the beginning of the difficult and delicate work of reconstruction. The words he spoke next were not loud, but they carried the full weight of his transformation. "This ends today," he said, his voice firm. The silence, the walls, the loneliness, all of it. He wasn't just speaking to Elena, but to himself, sealing a pact with the new version of himself that had just been born. The return to the estate was different from any other. Laura rode between them in the back seat, chattering about her new friends, and the sound of her voice filled the space previously occupied by tense business calls about interest rates and dividends. Arthur's first action upon crossing the gates wasn't to go to his office, but to the main living room. He stopped in the center of the vast, sterile space and observed it with critical eyes, as if analyzing an underperforming asset. It was there that he turned to Elena and revealed his plan. "I spent my life accumulating assets, building a fortune that could protect Laura," he began. "But I was protecting her from the wrong things. The real risk wasn't out there. It was in here." He gestured to the surrounding space. "This isn't a home, it's a vault, and I want to transform it. I want to open the doors. I want this place to have the same smell, the same sound as your little school. I want to create a space for Laura and for other children like her, a place of coexistence, of learning, and I can't do this alone." He looked into her eyes, his vulnerability exposed. "I don't want you to be Laura's nanny, Elena. I want you to be the soul of this project. As my partner, the offer was more than a job. It was the surrender of his trust, the transfer of control." Elena felt the weight and sincerity of his words. Her heart, still bruised, hesitated for an instant, fearing it was just another maneuver by a powerful man. But seeing the hope in Laura's eyes, who watched them with silent wisdom, she knew the change was real. "I accept," she said, her voice choked. "But with one condition: we will be partners in everything, the decisions, the work, the dreams." That was the true contract, sealed not with a signature, but with a handshake that promised a shared future. In the following days, the estate was invaded by a revolution. Where there was once silence, there was now the sound of hammers and saws. Mrs. Sterling, unable to comprehend or accept the new order, resigned with offended rigidity, leaving like a ghost from a past that no longer existed. Savannah, upon learning of Arthur's decision, called only once, her voice dripping with venom and disbelief. Arthur listened calmly and, at the end, simply said, "I am making the best investment of my life, Savannah. I am investing in my daughter's happiness." And he hung up, cutting the last thread that bound him to his old self. The white walls were painted with vibrant murals. The formal dining room gave way to a cheerful refectory, and the impeccable garden was transformed into an adapted playground. The house was shedding its cold wealth to dress itself in human warmth. A month had passed, a single lunar cycle that was enough to redesign a universe. Arthur Vance's estate was no longer recognizable. The silence had been expelled by the laughter of children running through the corridors, and the aseptic smell of cleanliness had been replaced by the constant aroma of brewed coffee and, of course, cornmeal cake. The project, named the Hearthstone Center, was now a fully functioning foundation, a community center that welcomed dozens of children with special needs from the neighborhood and other areas. The doors, once double-locked, now stood open. Arthur discovered that the true cash flow that mattered was one of smiles and hugs. He was still a billionaire. His portfolio in stocks and financial applications continued to grow by inertia, but his focus had shifted. He spent his days not on conference calls about the stock market, but in meetings with educators and therapists, learning a new vocabulary where inclusion and affection were the most valuable terms. His greatest return on investment was seeing the sparkle in his daughter's eyes. Eleanor flourished in her new role. She left behind the insecurity of being a mere employee to take over the project coordination, with a natural authority that came from the heart. She was the one who planned the activities, who talked to the families, who transformed donations into resources. She and Arthur formed an improbable but effective duo. He brought the structure, the resources, the ability to turn an idea into a sustainable business. She brought the soul, the purpose, the human connection. The relationship between them deepened every day, not in an explosion of passion, but in the slow, solid building of a partnership based on mutual admiration and a shared love for Laura. Their conversations at the end of the day, as the last children left, became a ritual. They talked about a student's progress, the project's challenges, and little by little about themselves. He learned about her grandmother, about her simple dreams. She learned about his loneliness, about the weight of the fortune that had isolated him. On one of those late afternoons, while watching Laura water the flowers in the new garden, Arthur held Elena's hand. He didn't say anything. The touch was enough. It was a silent promise of a future they would build together, brick by brick. That night, the kitchen, now the pulsating heart of the house, was illuminated by a soft light. On the table, a simple cornmeal cake, just like the first one. It wasn't anyone's birthday. It was just a celebration of life, of the path they had traveled. Laura sat between Arthur and Elena, her eyes